to continue on your thought about feedback and not taking it personally is really interesting that sometimes we take feedback personally even when the other person doesn't know us. Like we might ask for something and they might reject us. They don't know who we are, or they might say something about us and they don't know who we are, and we still take it personally, right? So it is such a journey, and important to understand how it's often not about us. We suffer from something called the spotlight effect. It's a human bias where we tend to think that we're kind of the center of the world, that other people are paying more attention to us than they actually are. And there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things going on in their lives. There's things that are about the way they think rather than the way we think. So yeah, feedback is just kind of information that is always good. I think getting more information about how we're affecting other people is always a good thing. But how can we overcome the performance paradox more broadly, to your question? I think the first step is to really understand the difference between performance and learning and start seeing where we are stuck in chronic performance and how that's getting in the way. And to understand that, it might be helpful to step outside of our context and look at fantastic performers in domains where performance can be objectively measured, and think about how they become so good. So for example, if you look at world-class athletes, we might think that a fantastic tennis player is so good because they spent so many hours playing tennis, but that's not the case. So if we look at like a professional tennis player, they're playing a championship final. If they're having trouble with a particular move, they'll avoid that move during that match because all they care about is winning. They're in what I call the performance zone. But then after the game, they'll go to their coach and say, "Coach, I have to work on this particular move that I was avoiding during the game." So that's a very different activity and area of attention than what we do during the game. And so that's what I call the learning zone. And what we're often doing in work and life is we're just always trying to do the best we can, trying to minimize mistakes. And we're just worried about getting things done. And that works while we are novices. Like when we're just starting to do something and we just try doing it, we'll get better just from trying. But then we'll stagnate when we become proficient. And so what we need to do is for most of us, the greatest opportunity is in shifting the way we do things so that we do things with two goals. One is to get things done, but second is to improve along the way, right? So that we're getting things done in a way that's going to lead to greater skills and greater insights. And to do that, we can't do the same thing every day the same way that we did the day before, for one thing. We need to change something. We need to experiment, tinker, try something new and see whether that works better or not. So that's one thing to think about is, are you shifting regularly the way you do things? We need to be soliciting feedback. It's a really, really powerful strategy. When we make mistakes, we need to not just disregard the mistakes, but we need to think about them and think about the root cause and think about what led to this mistake. What am I going to change in my systems and habits so that in the future we can avoid these mistakes? We can think about what we talk about in our meetings with our colleagues or in our conversations with our family. Do we talk about what we're learning or what questions we have or get their feedback? So those are some ideas, some sample strategies around things that we can do that are different from just getting the job done and just getting tasks checked off the list.
Yeah. And the first things that come to mind, I had read in a book one time that Tiger Woods would work with his coach and he would want to try a different grip to see what would happen. Or Wayne Gretzky, he would just fool around on his skates just to see what angle something would change. And so that's what I'm thinking of, how small, how incremental those changes are when you're in the learning zone. What came to my mind, Eduardo, when you were talking about that is, you hear about the learning zone, but there's also that panic zone when people talk about stretching out of your comfort zone. And what I understand is you're not talking about going beyond, you're testing how much you're capable of, but you're really breaking down some of the things that you're already doing to become more proficient with incremental and testing what's possible.
Yeah, there's different strategies that can work for different situations. A lot of world-class performers work at that kind of incremental zone that you're talking about, right? They engage in something called deliberate practice, which is where you identify a very specific sub-skill and you try something that's just beyond what you can do, to your point, right? And so you try something beyond, you're not going to do it perfectly, and based on repetition and feedback and adjustments, ideally with the guidance of a teacher or coach, then you can continue to get better at that. So definitely there's definitely that panic zone, like you're saying, of going so far beyond what you can do in a way that's not safe, right? That is it might create significant damage. We want to try to avoid that. And now there are situations where we might try something completely different, or go to a completely different domain, and just explore and tinker in safe ways, in ways that are not going to create damage. And that's okay too. That can lead to great revolutionary innovation. Like, for example, design thinking. In design thinking, you might be working on a problem, but then you might like go on an exploration of a museum and something completely unrelated, so that you can get ideas there and inspiration that might apply to the problem you're working on. So that's kind of going into the distant, but in a safe way. And so, yeah, thinking about in which ways, because we also want to be in the performance zone sometimes. So thinking about when and where do I want, and do we as a team want to be focusing on what we know works and just playing it safe. But then when and where do we want to be in the learning zone? Because if we don't habituate that, we're just going to stay at the same level of effectiveness.
And in the book, you talk about, how often people will have meetings, and when they go to meetings, they're not talking about what am I learning. It's kind of this checklist of who's doing what, kind of an update. And you're like, oh, sometimes you sit back and think, well, that could have been covered in an email, right? Versus having a richer conversation of what am I learning from this, or have someone be the devil's advocate and give a different perspective of how they're seeing things, to really have those richer conversations. Because otherwise, sometimes it feels quite superficial.
Yeah, and both are important, right? We want performance systems and learning systems. So whether it's in meetings or in asynchronous emails, in terms of updating each other or tracking our progress, our performance, we want those performance zone systems. But the question is, to your point, are we also embedding learning zone systems into those performance zone systems? And so, for example, at LinkedIn, the top 100 leaders have a weekly meeting. And in that meeting, they have a section of the meeting where they invite anybody to share something they learned the prior week and what anybody can do differently going forward as a result of what they learned. So that's just they want to change the conversation. They just change the agenda. They change the system. It's an easy thing to do. Right. And they're combining kind of performance and learning into the way that they do things every day.
Yeah. And, the difference between, and this is a key thing, because you often think, well, I'm doing it. If I do it more, I should be getting better, more proficient. But what you said, there's a huge difference between learning by doing and learning while doing. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit more on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's this term, learning by doing, which I think is confusing because it implies that if you just do, you will learn and you improve. But the people who kind of the theorists who came up with experiential learning in the first place, they recognize that it's not just by doing something that you get better. You need to do, but then you also need to reflect. You need to identify a hypothesis of something that might work better, and like test that hypothesis, like do something new that you haven't done before, see if it's going to work or not, and then again reflect on how well that worked. And so we can learn while doing. We can do things and improve along the way, but we have to be deliberate and mindful about how we do, so that we can actually achieve that.
It's interesting, when I was thinking about that learning by doing, and one of the examples in one of your TED Talks was about a lawyer who practiced speaking with rocks in his mouth for his lisp, or going by the ocean so it'd be noisy. And it's interesting because you think about these different things that I wouldn't even think to do something like that, right? And it's like, so how do you improve? And I know at one point in my speaking part of my career, I worked with an acting coach who also worked with coaches, but people who spoke from the stage, to implement Alexander technique, right? So it's more animal based, and you're really using your body in a different way. And I had never seen anything like it before, but it made me show up differently because I knew how it was used in acting and how that represented that person. So it was a really interesting way to make me think about, you know, trying something different that's not necessarily that straight line of practicing in the mirror, or, you know, having someone watching other people's videos. Because I would tell people initially when they're like, do you rewatch your videos? And when I first started doing it, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. I was like, because I didn't want to see or hear myself. And then over time, I'm like, okay, if I'm going to get better, I really need to be doing this, and not to go into that critique of self, but what can I learn here? What can I learn from other people that are doing these things? And even creating my own path of thinking, what would happen? You know, and yeah, it's interesting, the journey and things that you can pick up from things that are not necessarily industry specific. They almost become a metaphor as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think those are great examples. And they, like, for example, I narrated just kind of the afterword of my audiobook, and I worked for an hour with a voice coach, and they had me do all these things, like, you know, with a glass of water and a straw, and like blowing air into it, and just very different things than talking. And to your point, some things are closer to talking, like, you know, watching yourself talk and then thinking about what might work or what might not work.
Yeah.
But those are all different things than just going out there and doing more and more speeches, right? Or more and more keynotes. That leads to you know, getting stale and not actually getting better.
Yeah. No, very valuable. Is it possible to improve, especially in high pressure situations when it feels like there's no time to add anything to our plate? You know, with the pandemic, even we saw a lot of crisis situations. We see different situations that need people to be decisive. But how can you be decisive and learn at the same time, right? You have to be quick. So I would love to, you know, learn about a little bit more about those high pressure situations and how we can be more resilient in moving forward with those.
Absolutely. So first, there are times where the stakes are really, really high, and you want to just put your best foot forward, not take any risk. Like if you're a surgeon and you're doing surgery on a patient, during the surgery, you want to do the best that you know how, not experiment on the patient, right? And just be in your performance zone. And there's definitely times and places for that. But then after the surgery, or, you know, at a different time of your day or week, you want to be reviewing the new research about new techniques, or, you know, learning from a pharmaceutical rep about a new kind of compound that there might be, right? Or just talking to your peer surgeons about something that they're learning and something that they're doing that's working better for them. So for us, yeah, most of us feel really busy, right, to get so many things done, and that's the situation we're in. And sometimes that might lead us to think, this learning thing, that sounds really good, but I just don't have time for it. I have too much to do. But what we find time and time again across industries is that actually the people who figure out ways to habituate the learning zone as part of their performance zone, they get higher performance, and the relationship is really, really clear. And so it doesn't have to take much time, for sure. Like we can just simply every morning remind ourselves of what is one thing we're trying to improve, and that alone will help us think about kind of and notice opportunities for improvement, so that whatever surprises us or whatever mistakes we make, or there's somebody that we can ask a quick feedback from or ideas from, we can do that throughout the day without it taking much time at all.
Yeah. It's as simple as Googling tips to improve this, right? And we don't
Yeah.
necessarily think about it unless we come from a place of curiosity and want to, it's like, oh, I wonder if I did this, what would happen, right? So if mistakes are good for learning, but bad for performance, how should people approach it? Because I could see people being, I don't know if I want to go there, because if I make a mistake, I might not recover.
Absolutely. Mistakes are so important for learning. They drive our neuroplasticity. Is when the brain makes a prediction that turns out to be wrong. That is incredible learning that leads the wiring of our brain to change. On the other hand, like you're saying, mistakes lead to lower performance. Great performances involve few mistakes. So how can we reconcile this? In chapter 5, I talk about 4 different kinds of mistakes that help us better, like get a better understanding of when and how to engage in mistakes and how to take advantage of them. So the first one is the stretch mistake, which is when we're doing something that's difficult, that's beyond what we can do. We can't expect it to do it perfectly. We have to expect to make mistakes and to learn from those mistakes, and that's going to be really valuable learning. So those are the stretch mistakes. We want to be doing a lot of those, not by trying to do things incorrectly, but by trying to do things that are challenging. Second is the high stakes mistake, which are the mistakes that we make that have significant consequences. They create damage. We want to try to minimize those mistakes, right? When the stakes are high, we want to try to play it safe and be in our performance zone. So often there's ways to like embed mini experiments within things. So we're largely performing what we know will work, but we might like a little tweak here to see like how that will work here, usually to better serve that specific person that we're in front of. Third is a sloppy mistake. The sloppy mistake is when we do something we should have known better how to do. We shouldn't be making this mistake again. And when we make sloppy mistakes, we can ask ourselves, like, first, is this important or is this something to laugh at? I think mistakes can bring joy to our lives too. But also, if it is important, if it is something that we want to avoid in the future, then ask ourselves, what can I change? What's the root cause of this? And often it's either we lost focus or our systems weren't set up well and we were trying to do too many things at the same time, for example. And so there's often a valuable lesson there too. And then finally, there's the aha moment mistakes, which are when we do something as we intended, but then we realized it was the wrong thing to do. So those are really precious ahas, but they're less, it's harder to elicit them proactively. They surprise us, and so when they surprise us, it's important to notice them and to think about them and to think about what we can learn from them. And the one way that we can elicit more of them or uncover more of them is by regularly soliciting feedback. We'll get more aha moments that way as well. And so in thinking about these different kinds of mistakes, the key is that we want to do more stretch mistakes. We want to be proactive about learning from more stretch mistakes by doing things that are challenging. And the last thing I'll say about this is that it's also important to not weaponize mistakes. Like what I might see as a sloppy mistake that somebody else did, they might see as a stretch mistake or as an aha moment mistake. So we want to approach these conversations with curiosity, to understand where the other person was coming from, to understand what they're taking out of the situation, what they're learning. Because if they feel like they can't make mistakes or they will be reprimanded, then they will try to minimize mistakes all the time, which means they'll be in chronic performance all the time and they'll stagnate.